First he lost a war, then he lost his country. He was stripped of his honor and sentenced to death. After a narrow escape, he lost his wife to a devastating mental breakdown and his children to the winds of European society. Finally, he lost his life, alone in a hotel room during the Second World War. This is the story of Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, Prince Philip's father. It is a relentless tale of loss, a forgotten chapter of royal history that reveals the deep-seated tragedy at the heart of the man who would one day stand beside Queen Elizabeth II. Prince Andrew was born in 1882 into a world both precarious and paradoxical, an identity captured entirely by his title, Prince of Greece and Denmark. He was a prince of a poor, proud, and fiercely nationalistic Balkan kingdom, yet his blood and upbringing were almost entirely Danish, German, and Russian. This dual identity was not an accident. It was the product of a Europe that was governed like an exclusive and often dysfunctional family business. The modern kingdom of Greece was itself a creation of this system. After winning a bloody war of independence from the Ottoman Empire, the great powers of Europe decided Greece needed a foreign king to ensure stability. In 1863, they plucked the 17-year-old Prince Wilhelm of Denmark from Copenhagen, shipped him to Athens, converted him to Greek Orthodoxy, and proclaimed him George I, King of the Hellenes. To bind his new dynasty to a major power, he married the Russian Grand Duchess Olga Konstantinovna. This was the classic 19th century arrangement that created Andrew's family. Greek in name, but fundamentally foreign. This placed Andrew within that exclusive transnational club of European royalty presided over by its formidable matriarch, Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. She was, quite literally, the grandmother of Europe, and her descendants sat on nearly every throne. Andrew's family ties stretched from his palace in Athens to St. Petersburg, London, and Berlin. This international heritage would grant him immense privilege, but in a country as politically turbulent as Greece, being seen as a foreign prince was a dangerous liability. His life would be a constant struggle between his sworn duty to Greece and the complex, often conflicting loyalties of his royal blood. Prince Andrew's childhood was spent within the privileged confines of the royal palace in Athens and the family's sprawling country estate at Tatoi, a forested haven just outside the city. It was a thoroughly cosmopolitan upbringing. The language of the home was not Greek, but English, as his mother believed it was the best language for her children to learn in order to communicate with their vast network of British and German relatives. With his father, Andrew spoke Danish. With his mother, he spoke Russian. He learned German and French as a matter of course. He would only become truly fluent in the language of the people he was a prince of as a young adult entering the military. This linguistic disconnect was symbolic of the royal family's wider position in Greek society. They were respected as the heads of state, but they were also viewed as slightly separate, a dynasty set apart by their foreign origins and connections. Andrew and his siblings grew up in a world of tutors, governesses, and formal royal protocol, largely insulated from the daily life of ordinary Greeks. As the fourth son, there was no prospect of Andrew inheriting the throne. His path, like that of so many younger princes of his generation, was the military. It was a career he embraced with genuine passion and seriousness. He was enrolled in the Hellenic Army's Cadet Academy and later received private tutoring from one of Greece's most respected generals, Panagiotis Danglis. He proved to be an excellent student and a natural soldier. He was physically imposing, tall, athletic, and handsome, and possessed a keen intelligence and a deep sense of duty. He was commissioned into the Greek cavalry and began a steady climb through the officer ranks. Unlike some of his contemporaries who treated a military career as a fashionable hobby, Andrew saw it as his life's work. He was determined to be a commander, not just a prince in a uniform. His life, and indeed the map of European royalty, was about to be changed by a trip to London. In 1902, he was sent as a representative of the Greek royal family to attend the coronation of King Edward VII. The event was a spectacular gathering of the global elite, the high watermark of the British Empire. It was here, amidst the pomp and pageantry, that Andrew was formally introduced to a distant cousin, Princess Alice of Battenberg. Alice was one of the most intriguing royal figures of her generation. Born in 1885 in the Tapestry Room at Windsor Castle, with her great-grandmother Queen Victoria present, she was the eldest child of Prince Louis of Battenberg and Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine. Her mother was Queen Victoria's granddaughter, making Alice a direct link to the heart of the British monarchy. Her background was as pan-European as Andrew's. Her father's family was a morganatic branch of the German House of Hesse. Her mother was German and British. She grew up primarily in England, speaking English as her first language. What made Alice truly remarkable was that she had been born congenitally deaf. In an era that often hid away those with disabilities, her mother insisted she be raised to be as independent as possible. Alice, with fierce determination, learned to lip-read fluently in English, German, French, and later Greek. Her deafness gave her an aura of intense concentration and a unique, slightly detached perspective on the world. She was not only beautiful, but also highly intelligent, thoughtful, and possessed of a strong, if unconventional, will. The attraction between the dashing 20-year-old Greek prince and the ethereal 17-year-old Anglo-German princess was immediate and undeniable. He was charmed by her beauty and spirit. She was impressed by his worldly confidence. They were, in the intricate calculus of royal matchmaking, a perfect pair. They shared a common ancestry, a common social world, and a common understanding of the peculiar duties and privileges of their birth. Their engagement was announced shortly after, and their wedding was set for the following year in Alice's hometown of Darmstadt, the capital of the Grand Duchy of Hesse. The wedding, in October 1903, was a lavish multi-day affair, one of the last great royal spectacles before the world changed forever. It encapsulated the complex identities of the bride and groom. There were 3 separate ceremonies: a Lutheran one for the German bride, a Greek Orthodox one for the groom, and a civil one to satisfy the law. The guest list was a testament to their connections. The ill-fated Tsar Nicholas II and Tsarina Alexandra of Russia, Alice's aunt, sent a magnificent jeweled tiara. The German Emperor, Kaiser Wilhelm II, was there. King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra of Great Britain were represented. It was a final glittering family reunion before the political tensions of the coming decade would turn them all into enemies. For the young couple, however, it was simply the start of a life they believed would be filled with happiness, security, and purpose. Returning to Athens, Prince Andrew and Princess Alice settled into the life expected of them. They took up residence in a handsome neoclassical mansion, and Andrew resumed his military career with renewed focus. Alice, for her part, embraced her new country with enthusiasm. She quickly learned to lip-read Greek and dedicated herself to charitable works, becoming deeply involved in nursing and social welfare programs. Her quiet dignity and genuine compassion made her a popular, if somewhat reserved figure among the Greek people. This was a period of profound domestic happiness. Their family grew quickly with the arrival of their 4 daughters: Margarita in 1905, Theodora in 1906, Cecilia in 1911, and Sophie in 1914. Andrew was by all accounts a doting and proud father, and their home was a lively and loving one. It was, for a brief decade, a golden age for the young family, a life of tranquil privilege lived between their duties in Athens and long idyllic summers at their villa, Mon Repos, on the sun-drenched island of Corfu. This peace was shattered by the outbreak of the Balkan Wars in 1912. This was a series of two brutal conflicts in which Greece, allied with Serbia, Bulgaria, and Montenegro, fought to drive the last vestiges of the Ottoman Empire out of Europe. For Prince Andrew, this was the moment his years of training had been leading up to. He served as a cavalry officer with the rank of colonel, commanding troops in the field with conspicuous bravery. He was present at the capture of Thessaloniki, a hugely significant victory that brought a key region of Macedonia under Greek control. His performance during the wars solidified his reputation within the army as a serious and capable commander, not just a decorative royal. The wars were a resounding success for Greece, which nearly doubled its territory and population, but they also unleashed a new wave of intense nationalism and political instability. The assassination of Andrew's father, King George I, in Thessaloniki in 1913, brought his elder brother, Constantine, to the throne. King Constantine was a skilled military leader, but he was also politically rigid and held strong pro-German sympathies, thanks to his wife Sophia, who was the sister of Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm II. When the First World War erupted in 1914, this pro-German leaning put the king on a direct collision course with his own prime minister, the charismatic and fiercely pro-Allied Eleftherios Venizelos. This clash between the king and the prime minister, known as the National Schism, tore Greece apart. It became a bitter, quasi-civil war between the royalists and the republicans, a political wound that would fester for decades and directly lead to the disaster that would soon engulf Prince Andrew. Caught in the middle of this political firestorm, Andrew and his family were forced into their first exile in 1917, when the Allies backed a coup that deposed King Constantine. They spent the next 3 years living in Switzerland, a period of uncertainty and frustration. They were only able to return to Greece in 1920 after Constantine was restored to the throne following a surprising election victory. But they returned to a country that was more divided than ever, a nation drunk on a dangerous cocktail of victory from the Balkan Wars and a renewed feverish belief in the Megali idea. It was in this toxic political atmosphere and fervent nationalist ambition that Greece, with Prince Andrew in a high command position, embarked on its most ambitious and ultimately catastrophic military adventure. A king restored to his throne, a prince returned to his command, a nation brimming with a dangerous sense of destiny. When Prince Andrew and his family returned to Greece in 1920, it was to a country on the brink of what it believed would be its greatest triumph. The First World War had shattered the old empires, and in the chaotic aftermath, the borders of Europe were being redrawn. For Greece, this was a golden opportunity, a chance to finally achieve the dream that had haunted its national consciousness for a century, the Megali idea, the great idea of a new Greek empire rising from the ashes of the old Ottoman one. But this was a dream that would turn into a nightmare. The next 2 years would see Prince Andrew, now a senior commander, lead his soldiers deep into the heart of a hostile land in a war of brutal conquest. It was a campaign that would begin with victory and end in one of the most complete and humiliating military disasters of the 20th century. It would lead to his arrest, a trial for high treason, and a death sentence. To understand the man, we must first understand the catastrophe that broke him. This is the story of the Greco-Turkish War, the bloody conflict that would strip a prince of everything he had and turn him into a fugitive, fighting for his life. The fuse for the disaster was lit in May 1919. With the Ottoman Empire defeated in the Great War, the Allied powers, led by Britain, France, and Italy, began carving it up. As part of this process, they authorized Greece to land troops at the ancient port city of Smyrna on the Aegean coast of Anatolia. The official reason was to protect the city's massive ethnic Greek population from Turkish reprisals. But for the Greek government led by Prime Minister Venizelos, this was the first step towards realizing the great idea. Smyrna, with its vibrant Greek culture and history, was seen as a jewel to be reclaimed for the Hellenic world. The Greek army was met by euphoric crowds of local Greeks, waving blue and white flags and showering the soldiers with flowers. But this joyous welcome quickly soured. The landing was accompanied by violence and chaos, with Greek soldiers firing on Turkish barracks and civilians. This initial bloodshed planted the seeds of a deep and bitter hatred that would define the war to come. More dangerously, it galvanized the scattered Turkish nationalist forces, who saw the Greek landing not as a peacekeeping mission, but as a hostile invasion by a historic enemy, intent on carving up their homeland. A leader for this resistance soon emerged, Mustafa Kemal, a brilliant, iron-willed general who had been one of the few Ottoman heroes of the First World War. From the remote heart of Anatolia, he began to organize a new Turkish Grand National Army, dedicated to expelling all foreign forces from Turkish soil. By the time Prince Andrew's brother, King Constantine, was restored to the throne in late 1920, the situation had grown even more perilous. The Allies, who had supported the initial Greek landing under Venizelos, were deeply suspicious of the pro-German Constantine. France and Italy, pursuing their own interests in the region, began to secretly arm and support Mustafa Kemal's nationalists. Britain was still publicly supportive, but its aid was wavering. Greece was becoming increasingly isolated but blinded by a century of nationalist ambition. Its government made a fateful decision to escalate the war, crush Kemal's forces, and impose their will on Anatolia by force. Prince Andrew, now promoted to lieutenant general and given command of the powerful Second Army Corps, was tasked with being one of the primary instruments of this ambitious and ultimately foolhardy policy. In the summer of 1921, the Greek army launched its largest offensive of the war. The goal was audacious to the point of recklessness: to march hundreds of miles inland, across punishing terrain and through hostile territory, to capture Mustafa Kemal's capital at Ankara and destroy his army once and for all. Prince Andrew, at the head of his 3 divisions, was a key part of this vast invading force. He was a commander who led from the front. He was known for his personal bravery and his meticulous attention to the welfare of his men. But the campaign was a logistical nightmare. The further the Greek army marched from its coastal supply bases at Smyrna, the more tenuous its lifeline became. The single railway line leading inland was constantly being sabotaged by Turkish irregulars. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies dwindled. The soldiers marched under a blistering summer sun, their thick woolen uniforms turning into instruments of torture. Water was scarce, and disease began to spread through the ranks. Despite these immense challenges, the initial stages of the offensive were a success. The Greek army, better equipped and more experienced at conventional warfare, pushed the Turkish forces back in a series of hard-fought battles, most notably at Kütahya Eskişehir. They inflicted heavy casualties and captured huge amounts of territory, but they had failed to achieve their primary objective, to encircle and destroy the Turkish army. Kemal's forces, though battered, had conducted a masterful fighting retreat, drawing the Greeks ever deeper into the Anatolian plateau, stretching their supply lines to the breaking point. After the victory at Kütahya Eskişehir, the Greek high command faced a critical choice. They could halt their advance and consolidate their gains, or they could gamble everything on one final desperate push to Ankara. Prince Andrew and several other senior commanders advised caution. They argued that the army was exhausted, its logistics were collapsing, and that an attack on Ankara, now heavily fortified, was too great a risk. But the political leadership in Athens, hungry for a decisive victory to justify the enormous cost of the war, overruled the generals. The order was given. The army was to march on Ankara. It was a decision driven by political hubris, and it would lead directly to the abyss. The Greek army, weary and overstretched, began its final fateful advance towards the Sakaria River. The Battle of the Sakaria River, which began in late August 1921, was the turning point of the war and the defining moment of Prince Andrew's military career. For 21 days and nights, over 100,000 Greek soldiers threw themselves against the heavily entrenched Turkish defensive lines on the east bank of the river. It was a battle of almost unbearable ferocity, a brutal attritional struggle of bayonet charges, artillery duels, and desperate hand-to-hand combat. Prince Andrew and his Second Army Corps were positioned on the southern flank of the Greek advance. From the outset, the battle went badly for the Greeks. The Turkish forces, fighting with the desperation of men defending their homeland, resisted with ferocious courage. The Greek high command, led by General Anastasios Papoulas, seemed to be in a state of paralysis. Plans were made, changed, and countermanded. Communication between the various army corps was poor, and the overall strategy seemed confused and reactive. It was in this chaotic and bloody stalemate that Prince Andrew made the most controversial decision of his life. He was a man of action and initiative, trained to think for himself on the battlefield. Observing that the main frontal assaults were failing with catastrophic losses, and believing he had spotted a weakness in the Turkish flank, he decided to act. He requested permission from General Papoulas to shift his entire corps from its defensive position and launch an independent attack to outflank the enemy. Here, accounts diverge, and the fog of war descends. According to Prince Andrew's own detailed account in his memoir Towards Disaster, General Papoulas gave him a vague verbal and conditional approval for the maneuver. Armed with this ambiguous consent, Andrew began to move his troops. However, the high command in the rear seemed unaware of this, and at a critical moment sent him a written order to halt his advance. Believing this order was based on outdated information and that he was on the verge of a breakthrough, Andrew made a fateful choice. He ignored it. He pressed on with his attack, convinced that a decisive victory would justify his insubordination. His critics and the prosecutors at his later court-martial would paint a very different picture. They argued that he had received a clear and direct order to hold his position, and that he had willfully and arrogantly disobeyed it. They claimed that by moving his troops without authorization, he had opened a dangerous gap in the main Greek line, endangered other units, and ultimately wrecked the coherence of the entire offensive. Whatever the truth of the orders, Andrew's attack ultimately failed. His soldiers, though fighting with immense bravery, could not break the Turkish lines. After suffering heavy casualties, they were forced to fall back. The wider Greek offensive had also stalled all along the front. The army was shattered, its morale broken, its offensive power spent. General Populus, realizing the battle was lost, gave the order for a general retreat. The Greek army, bled white on the banks of the Sakaria, began its long, sorrowful march back towards the coast. The dream of conquering Ankara was dead. The Megali idea had been dealt a mortal blow, and Prince Andrew, through his actions in the heat of battle, had unwittingly provided his political enemies with the ammunition they would later use to destroy him. The year that followed the defeat at the Sakaria was a year of grim, foreboding stalemate. The Greek army dug in, occupying a vast swathe of Anatolia, but it was an army without a purpose. The soldiers were exhausted, demoralized, and deeply homesick. The government in Athens, facing a political and economic crisis, could offer no clear strategy. The army was left to slowly rot, a forgotten expeditionary force stranded deep in enemy territory. Meanwhile, on the other side of the line, Mustafa Kemal was patiently rebuilding his forces. Bolstered by secret aid from the French, the Italians, and the Soviet Union, he trained and re-equipped his army, preparing for the final decisive blow. That blow came on August 26, 1922. In what the Turks would call the Great Offensive, Kemal's army launched a massive surprise attack that shattered the Greek front line. What followed was one of the most complete military collapses of the 20th century. The Greek army, its will to fight long since evaporated, simply disintegrated. Entire divisions were encircled and surrendered without a fight. Discipline vanished. The retreat became a panicked, chaotic rout. Soldiers abandoned their weapons and fled in a desperate race for the coast, pursued relentlessly by the Turkish cavalry. Prince Andrew's Second Army Corps was one of the few formations that managed to maintain some semblance of order, conducting a fighting retreat that saved thousands of men from capture, a fact that would be conveniently ignored at his trial. The final horrific act of the war took place at Smyrna. The city was overwhelmed by a flood of terrified refugees, both Greek soldiers and Anatolian Greek civilians, all desperate to escape the advancing Turkish army. The harbor was a scene of chaos, with Allied warships looking on with clinical indifference as the remnants of the Greek army were evacuated. On September 9th, the Turkish army entered the city. A few days later, a fire broke out in the Armenian quarter. Fanned by the wind, it quickly spread, engulfing the Greek and European sections of the city in a terrifying firestorm. The scenes that followed were apocalyptic. Tens of thousands of civilians were trapped on the waterfront, caught between the inferno behind them and the sea in front. The harbor was filled with the bodies of those who had drowned trying to swim to the ships. The fire raged for days, utterly destroying the ancient Christian heart of the city and effectively erasing 3 millennia of Hellenic civilization in Asia Minor. The great idea had died in the most horrific way imaginable. The news of the disaster, the complete destruction of the army, and the burning of Smyrna hit Athens like an earthquake. The national pride and ambition of the past 3 years turned into a bottomless well of rage, grief, and humiliation. The nation was screaming for vengeance. The army, what was left of it, mutinied. On September 24th, a revolutionary committee of Republican officers, led by Colonel Nikolaos Plastiras, demanded the abdication of the king and the punishment of those responsible for the catastrophe. King Constantine, broken and defeated, abdicated and fled the country, never to return. The revolutionary government took control of Greece, and their first order of business was to hunt down the scapegoats. Prince Andrew was on the island of Corfu, at his summer villa, Mon Repos, with his wife and children, including the 1-year-old Philip. He had successfully evacuated his men and believed he had done his duty to the last. He watched the political events in Athens with growing alarm, but he did not believe he was in any personal danger. He was wrong. The new regime saw in him the perfect target, a prince, a senior commander, and a man already surrounded by the controversy of his actions at the Sakaria. He was to be the royal sacrifice offered up to appease the wrath of a betrayed nation. One afternoon, revolutionary officers arrived at the villa. They placed Prince Andrew under arrest, informing him that he was to be transported to Athens to stand trial for high treason. His world, already shattered on the battlefield, now collapsed entirely. The life of a prince was over. The fight for the survival of a prisoner was about to begin. The journey from the idyllic shores of Corfu to the port of Piraeus was one of profound humiliation. Prince Andrew, a man accustomed to the salutes of soldiers and the deference of officials, was now a captive, escorted by armed guards from the very army he had once commanded. Upon his arrival in Athens, he was not taken to a comfortable house arrest, but was confined to a small Spartan room under constant watch. His wife, Princess Alice, frantic with worry, was occasionally permitted to bring him food and fresh linen, passing through lines of hostile soldiers to spend a few precious supervised moments with her husband. His psychological state was one of turmoil. He was consumed by a burning sense of injustice. In his mind, he was a patriot who had served his country to the best of his ability under impossible circumstances. He had commanded his corps with bravery, and when the front collapsed due to catastrophic failures in high command, he had successfully extricated his men, saving them from the fate that befell other units. Now, he was being branded a traitor, his name dragged through the mud by a revolutionary government desperate to deflect blame from itself. This sense of betrayal was compounded by a gnawing, visceral fear. He knew the mood in Athens was murderous. He was a prince of a deposed king, a symbol of the old regime, and the new government was in a hanging mood. While Andrew languished in his cell, Princess Alice became a tigress, fighting for her husband's life. Throwing aside all royal protocol, she began a frantic campaign of letter writing and telegrams, pleading with her powerful relatives for help. She wrote to her mother in London, who in turn put pressure on her cousin, King George V. She appealed to the King and Queen of Spain. She contacted diplomats, politicians, anyone who would listen. She understood that Andrew's fate would not be decided by justice in a courtroom, but by political pressure from outside Greece. She was his only hope. Her pleas did not fall on deaf ears, but the situation was delicate. The great powers were wary of the new revolutionary regime in Greece, but did not want to provoke a major international incident. The British government in particular was in a difficult position. They had once been Greece's greatest champion in the war, but they had no love for the deposed, pro-German King Constantine, Andrew's brother. Yet allowing the execution of a prince so closely related to their own royal family was unthinkable. As the wheels of diplomacy began to grind slowly, the judicial machine in Athens was moving with terrifying speed. Andrew's life was now a race against time. Before Prince Andrew could be court-martialed, the revolutionary government staged its main event, a sensational show trial of the senior politicians and military leaders of the previous regime. This became known as the Trial of the Six. The defendants were a who's who of the government that had presided over the war. Dimitrios Gounaris, a former prime minister, Petros Protopapadakis, the prime minister at the time of the collapse, Nikolaos Stratos, another former prime minister, and several key cabinet ministers, along with General Georgios Hatzianestis, the commander-in-chief of the army in its final days. The trial, which began in early November 1922, was a legal travesty. It was held in the Parliament building under the intimidating presence of armed soldiers. The judges were military officers loyal to the revolution. Evidence was fabricated, testimony was coerced, and the defendants were given little opportunity to mount a proper defense. The trial was broadcast to the public via loudspeakers, whipping up the angry crowds that had gathered outside. The verdict was a foregone conclusion. The purpose of the trial was not justice. It was state-sanctioned revenge. On November 28, 1922, the verdict was delivered. All the defendants were found guilty of high treason. The sentence was death. There was an audible gasp in the courtroom, followed by cheers from the street outside. Appeals for clemency from foreign governments were ignored. Just a few hours later, in the gray morning light, the 6 men were taken to the Athens suburb of Goudi and executed by firing squad. The news of the execution sent a shockwave across Europe and a chill of pure terror down Prince Andrew's spine. The revolutionary government had shown that it was deadly serious. It had just executed the country's most senior politicians and its top general. What hope was there for a mere prince, a man who was already a target of Republican hatred? His own court-martial was about to begin, and the precedent for his fate had just been set in the most brutal way imaginable. He was now, in all but name, a dead man walking. The executions of the 6 galvanized the British government into action. King George V was appalled, and the Foreign Office, led by Lord Curzon, realized that the life of Prince Andrew was now in immediate and grave danger. The man on the ground in Athens was Sir Robert Hodgson, the acting British High Commissioner, but the man chosen for the delicate and dangerous task of direct intervention was Commander Gerald Talbot, a charismatic and well-connected naval attaché. Talbot was dispatched to negotiate directly with the formidable and ruthless leader of the revolution, Colonel Theodoros Pangalos. Pangalos was a hardliner, a man who despised the monarchy and who had been a driving force behind the executions. According to Talbot's own account, his first meeting with Pangalos was terrifying. The Greek colonel was volatile and openly hostile, at one point allegedly shouting that Prince Andrew was lucky that he, Pangalos, did not have him shot, on the principle that it is better to shoot a man when he is useless than when he may be dangerous. Talbot, using a masterful blend of charm flattery and thinly veiled threats, began his delicate dance of diplomacy. He knew that the revolutionary government, for all its bluster, was desperate for international recognition, particularly from the naval superpower, Great Britain. The British fleet was a constant, powerful presence in the Mediterranean. Talbot's argument was simple. Britain would not and could not formally recognize a regime that had just executed 5 former prime ministers and was now planning to execute a prince of the blood. However, if the prince's life were to be spared, it would be seen as an act of civilized statesmanship, a gesture that would go a long way towards normalizing relations. Behind the scenes, Lord Curzon was applying immense pressure at an international conference in Lausanne. He made it clear to the Greek delegation that there would be no friendly relations, no financial aid, and no support for Greece's territorial claims if Prince Andrew was harmed. It was a classic display of gunboat diplomacy, but with words instead of cannons. Slowly, reluctantly, the Greek regime began to buckle. Pangalos and his colleagues realized that executing Andrew would make them international pariahs and could have disastrous consequences for their new government. They agreed to a compromise. Prince Andrew's court-martial would proceed, and he would be found guilty. But the sentence would not be death. It would be military degradation and perpetual banishment from Greece. His life would be spared. The deal was struck, but Talbot knew that in the volatile atmosphere of Athens, A deal could be broken as easily as it was made. He had to get the prince out, and he had to do it fast. While the secret negotiations were taking place, Prince Andrew's court-martial delivered its predictable verdict. He was found guilty of disobedience of orders and failure of initiative. On December 3, 1922, he was brought before a military panel to hear his sentence. He was publicly stripped of his rank and titles and sentenced to be banished from Greece for life. For Andrew, it was a moment of profound humiliation, but also one of overwhelming relief. He was going to live. Commander Talbot, however, was taking no chances. He feared that the angry mobs in Athens, enraged that the prince had escaped the firing squad, might take matters into their own hands. He also didn't trust Pangalos not to change his mind. He had arranged for a British light cruiser, the HMS Calypso, to be waiting in Falaran Bay just outside Athens. The moment the sentence was passed, Talbot put his escape plan into action. Prince Andrew was not returned to his prison, but was instead placed under British protection. He was hurried into a car and driven through the dark streets of Athens to a small, secluded harbor. There, a small launch was waiting. As he stepped aboard, he was finally a free man. The launch sped out across the dark water towards the imposing silhouette of the British warship. On the deck of the Calypso, he was met by his wife, Alice. She had brought their 4 daughters and their infant son with her from Corfu. The reunion was one of overwhelming emotion, relief, sorrow, and the dawning bitter realization that they were now homeless refugees. They had nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few suitcases. As the family was shown to their quarters, the most enduring and poignant image of their escape was created. The ship's sailors, taking pity on the royal baby with no cot, fashioned a makeshift bed for him out of a wooden crate that had once held oranges. It was in this humble, improvised bed that the 1-year-old Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark was carried into exile. It was a symbol of just how far his family had fallen. As the HMS Calypso weighed anchor and its engines began to turn, Prince Andrew stood on the deck, watching the shores of his homeland recede into the darkness. He had been born a prince of Greece, had served it as a soldier for his entire adult life, and was now leaving it as a convicted traitor, banished forever. He was alive, but his life as he had known it was over. The family's journey ended in Brindisi, Italy, from where they traveled by train to Paris, settling in a borrowed house in the suburb of Saint-Cloud. They were royal refugees, living on the charity of relatives, a life of genteel poverty and enforced idleness. They had escaped the firing squad in Athens, but they had entered a new kind of prison, a prison of memory and loss. The external political drama was over, but a new, more insidious and devastating internal drama, one that would lead to the complete shattering of his family, was just beginning. He tried to create a new routine. He would wake, dress impeccably, and spend his days in the cafes of Paris, meeting with other members of the exiled Greek community. They would spend hours reliving the past, refighting the old battles, endlessly debating who was to blame for the catastrophe. It was a life lived in the rearview mirror, a world of ghosts and regrets. He was a man consumed by the injustice that had been done to him, a bitterness that began to poison his spirit and cast a long shadow over his family. Princess Alice tried to adapt. She enrolled the children in local schools and dedicated herself to charity work, opening a small shop that sold Greek arts and crafts to help support other refugees. But the trauma of the past few years, her husband's deepening depression, and the humiliation of their exile were taking a severe toll on her already fragile psyche. The political catastrophe was over, but a far more intimate and devastating tragedy was about to unfold. This is the story of the shattering of a family. It is a story of a prince's descent into bitterness, a princess's retreat into a world of divine visions, and the scattering of their 5 children across a continent on the brink of war. This is the chapter where the public disgrace of Prince Andrew gives way to the private agony of his family, a decade of quiet suffering that would leave his only son, Philip, effectively orphaned and forever shape the man he would become. Their new life began in a handsome villa in the leafy, affluent Parisian suburb of Saint Cloud. The house was loaned to them by Andrew's immensely wealthy sister-in-law, Princess Marie Bonaparte, a woman who had married into the family that owned the Monte Carlo casino and was a devoted disciple of Sigmund Freud. The home was elegant, comfortable, and a world away from the prison cell Andrew had recently occupied. Yet, it was a gilded cage. For a family accustomed to the sprawling palaces of Athens and the sun-drenched freedom of Corfu, this borrowed house, however lovely, was a constant reminder of their reduced circumstances. They were royal refugees, living on the financial support of their relatives. Princess Alice's mother, the Dowager Marchioness of Milford Haven, and her brother George Mountbatten provided a modest allowance. It was enough to live on, but not enough to replicate the life they had lost. They were forced into a world of genteel poverty where every expense had to be considered, a humiliating reality for a man who had once been a senior general and a prince of the Hellenes. Prince Andrew struggled profoundly to adapt. What does a 40-year-old soldier do when he has no army, no country, and no war to fight? He found himself utterly without purpose. His days fell into a repetitive, aimless pattern. He would wake late, dress impeccably in the English style, and travel into central Paris. There, he would sit for hours in the cafes and private clubs frequented by other royal exiles, deposed Russian Grand Dukes, minor German princes, and the small, bitter community of the displaced Greek court. Their conversations were an endless post-mortem of their shared downfall. They would refight the battles of the past, dissect the political intrigues, and rail against the injustices that had befallen them. Andrew, in particular, was obsessed. He was consumed with a need to clear his name, to prove that he had been a victim of a political conspiracy, not a military failure. This bitterness began to harden him, creating an emotional distance between him and his family. He was physically present in St. Cloud, but his mind was still on the battlefields of Anatolia. While her husband retreated into the past, Princess Alice desperately tried to build a future. She was the one who had to manage the household on a tight budget, who had to oversee the children's education, and who had to navigate the complex social world of the Parisian elite. She threw herself into her work, opening a small shop called Hellas that sold Greek embroidery and art, with the proceeds going to support other, less fortunate Greek refugees. It was a noble effort, a way to maintain her dignity and find a sense of purpose. But the strain was beginning to show. The accumulated trauma of the escape, the constant financial worry, her husband's deepening depression, and her own profound deafness created a perfect storm of psychological pressure. The unraveling of Princess Alice was not a sudden event, but a slow, terrifying descent. Her always deep Greek Orthodox faith, which had been a source of comfort, began to warp into a fervent, all-consuming religious mania. She had always been spiritual, but now she began to believe she was receiving direct divine revelations. She claimed to be in communication with God, and eventually that she was in a physical marital relationship with Jesus Christ. Her behavior became increasingly bizarre and alarming to those around her. She would enter trance-like states for hours, claiming to be receiving instructions from on high. She became convinced she possessed miraculous healing powers and she began to perform faith healings, attempting to cure people of serious illnesses through the laying on of hands. Her 4 daughters, now teenagers, were frightened and bewildered by their mother's transformation. Prince Andrew, a pragmatic and conventional man, was utterly at a loss. He could face down an enemy army, but he had no idea how to handle a wife who believed she was the bride of Christ. The family home, once a haven of love and stability, became a place of tension and fear. By 1930, Alice's condition had reached a crisis point. Her delusions were becoming more intense, and her connection to reality was fraying completely. Her concerned mother, Victoria, the Dowager Marchioness of Milford Haven, decided that drastic action was needed. She consulted with Princess Marie Bonaparte, Andrew's sister-in-law. Marie, a passionate advocate for the new and fashionable science of psychoanalysis, was convinced that Alice's problems were rooted in sexual and psychological conflicts. She consulted with her own psychoanalyst, who in turn recommended a colleague in Berlin who specialized in such cases. They decided, without Andrew's full understanding of the implications, that Alice needed to be institutionalized. The family concocted a ruse. They told Alice she was being taken to see a specialist in Darmstadt for a minor gynecological issue. In reality, 2 doctors arrived at the villa in St. Cloud, and under this false pretext escorted a compliant Alice into a car. They did not drive to Darmstadt. They drove her to the Tegel Sanatorium in Berlin, a high-security institution run by a student of Sigmund Freud. She was, in effect, medically kidnapped by her own family. The diagnosis, reached from a Freudian perspective, was as brutal as it was misinformed. The doctors concluded she was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, brought on by what they termed libidinal frustration. They believed her intense religious visions were simply a pathological transference of her sexual desires. From Berlin, she was forcibly moved to what was then one of the most famous mental institutions in the world, the Bellevue Sanatorium in Kreuzlingen, Switzerland, under the care of the renowned psychiatrist Dr. Ludwig Binswanger. Here, her treatment entered a new and disturbing phase. Convinced that her religious mania was caused by overactive hormones, the clinic's doctors subjected her to a series of terrifying procedures. The most infamous of these was the repeated X-raying of her ovaries and womb. The goal was to destroy her reproductive organs, induce an early menopause, and thereby extinguish the sexual desires that they believed were the root cause of her madness. It was a barbaric and misogynistic form of treatment, based on a complete misunderstanding of her condition, which modern experts believe was likely a severe case of bipolar affective disorder. For more than 2 years, Princess Alice was a prisoner. She was held against her will, cut off from her children, and subjected to torturous treatments. She wrote desperate, lucid letters to her mother, pleading for her release and insisting she was sane, but her protests were dismissed as further evidence of her illness. Her husband Andrew, broken and adrift himself, effectively abandoned her to her fate, rarely visiting and seemingly accepting the doctor's verdict. The woman who had been born in Windsor Castle was now a nameless patient in a Swiss asylum, her life and body under the complete control of strangers. The forced institutionalization of Princess Alice was the final, fatal blow to the already fractured family. The house in St. Cloud, which had been their only real home in exile, was closed down. The family unit, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. Prince Andrew, now a 48-year-old widower in all but name, was either unwilling or unable to care for his 5 children. He allowed them to be scattered across Europe, each sent to live with more stable and financially secure relatives. The 4 daughters were married off in rapid succession, Within a year of their mother's commitment, all four were engaged or married to German princes. Margarita married Gottfried, Prince of Hohenlohe-Langenburg. Theodora married Berthold, Margrave of Baden. Cecilia married Georg Donatus, hereditary Grand Duke of Hesse and by Rhine. And the youngest, Sophie, married Prince Christoph of Hesse. On the surface, these were brilliant dynastic matches, connecting them to some of the oldest aristocratic families in Germany. But these marriages would have unimaginably tragic consequences a decade later when their husbands would become officers in the Nazi regime, placing them on the opposite side of the coming war from their only brother. That brother, 9-year-old Prince Philip, was now utterly adrift. Of all the children, he was the most directly affected by the family's collapse. He was passed around like a lost piece of luggage. He spent some time living with his grandmother Victoria at Kensington Palace in London. He then lived with his uncle George Mountbatten and his glamorous wife Nada. Finally, it was decided that he needed the stability and discipline of a British boarding school education. He was sent first to Cheam School and then to the famously Spartan and demanding Gordonstoun School in Scotland, founded by the German Jewish educator Kurt Hahn. For the next 5 years, from the age of 9 to 14, Philip would not see his mother once. His contact with his father was sporadic at best, a few letters, a rare holiday visit. He was raised by his Mountbatten uncles, George, and after George's early death, the charismatic and hugely ambitious Louis Dickey Mountbatten. They provided him with a home and an education, but it was a childhood marked by a profound sense of abandonment and emotional insecurity. He learned early on to be tough, self-reliant, and to hide his feelings behind a gruff, guarded exterior. The sensitive boy had been replaced by a hardened young man. He was, in everything but title, an orphan. While his son was forging a new identity as an Englishman, Prince Andrew retreated from life. With his family gone, he left Paris and settled into a life of aimless obscurity on the French Riviera, the sun-drenched playground of the wealthy, the famous, and the exiled. He divided his time between Cannes and the glittering, amoral principality of Monte Carlo. He lived in modest hotel rooms or small rented apartments, a lonely figure amidst the glamour and excess. His constant companion during these years was a woman named Countess André de la Bigne, a glamorous and wealthy French actress and socialite. She became his mistress and his partner, providing him with the companionship and financial support he could no longer find from his own family. Their relationship was an open secret among the European elite. To many, it was proof that he had callously abandoned his sick wife. The reality was likely more complex. He was a deeply wounded and lonely man who, in his own broken way, was seeking solace in a semblance of a normal life. André offered him an escape from the ghosts of his past. His days fell into a listless routine. He would read, walk along the promenade, and spend long afternoons in the opulent casinos of Monte Carlo, though he was by all accounts a cautious gambler. He was a man with no job, no duties, and no responsibilities. His royal title was now just a curiosity, a relic from a lost world. He was a living ghost haunted by memories of the life that had been stolen from him. In November 1937, the shattered family was brought together one last terrible time. Andrew's third and favorite daughter, Cecilia, who was 8 months pregnant, was flying with her husband, 2 of their young sons, and her mother-in-law to a family wedding in London. Their plane, flying through thick fog over Ostend, Belgium, struck a factory chimney and crashed, killing everyone on board. The funeral was held a few days later in Darmstadt, the ancestral home of the House of Hesse. It was a grim, surreal gathering that brought the entire broken family together for the first time in years. Prince Andrew traveled from the Riviera. Princess Alice, now released from the sanatorium but still emotionally fragile, came from her solitary wanderings in Europe, and a 16-year-old Prince Philip, a cadet at Dartmouth Naval College, was given leave to attend, traveling alone from England. The newsreel footage from that day is haunting. It shows a grief-stricken family walking in the funeral procession through streets lined with crowds giving the Nazi salute. Prince Andrew, his face a mask of sorrow, walks beside his estranged wife, Alice. Behind them, their teenage son, Philip, marches, his handsome face set and rigid, surrounded by his 3 surviving brothers-in-law, all dressed in the uniforms of the Nazi Party. It was a scene of almost unbearable tragedy, a family united in grief but already divided by the political ideologies that were about to plunge the world into war. After the funeral, the family dispersed once more, each returning to their separate, lonely lives, not knowing that the storm clouds of a greater global conflict were gathering on the horizon, a war that would turn their personal separation into an unbridgeable chasm and set the stage for Prince Andrew's final years of solitude. Andrew went back to André and the casinos of Monte Carlo. Alice retreated further into her solitary spiritual world, and Philip returned to Britain and the Royal Navy, the only real home and family he now had. The coming of the Second World War would take the private tragedy of the House of Greece and Denmark and explode it onto a global stage. It would turn their personal separation into an unbridgeable political and military chasm, a chasm that would leave Prince Andrew utterly, finally, and irrevocably alone. This is the story of his last years, lived out in the shadow of a world at war and of the astonishing ironic legacy that would rise from the ashes of his tragic life. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, the divisions within Prince Andrew's family became a stark and painful reality. Their story became a microcosm of the European Civil War itself, a house divided, with brother-in-law pitted against brother-in-law, and a father and son separated by the front lines. In Britain, Prince Andrew's only son, Philip, now a dashing and highly capable young officer in the Royal Navy, threw himself into the war effort with patriotic zeal. He served with distinction aboard battleships and destroyers in the Indian Ocean, the North Sea, and most crucially, the Mediterranean. At the pivotal nighttime naval battle of Cape Matapan in March 1941, which resulted in a decisive victory for the Royal Navy over the Italian fleet, the 19-year-old Philip was in charge of the searchlights on HMS Valiant. His coolness and efficiency in illuminating the enemy ships at critical moments earned him a mention in dispatches, a formal recognition of his bravery. He was a British hero, a young prince fighting for the Allied cause, his life defined by clear purpose and unwavering duty. Thousands of miles away in the heart of the Third Reich, his 4 sisters were living a very different reality. They were, by marriage, German princesses, the wives of high-ranking German aristocrats who, like most men of their class, became officers in the Nazi war machine. Prince Andrew's son-in-law, Prince Christoph of Hesse, the husband of his youngest and favorite daughter Sophie, was a director in the Third Reich's air ministry and a Standartenführer in the SS, serving on the personal staff of Heinrich Himmler. Another son-in-law, Gottfried, Prince of Hohenlohe-Langenburg, served as an officer on the Eastern Front, where he was eventually wounded. The husbands of his other 2 daughters also served in the German army. The situation was one of almost unbearable irony. Prince Philip was at sea, hunting enemy ships and submarines, while his own brothers-in-law were serving the regime that was sending them out. In the middle of this continental schism were the 2 estranged parents. Princess Alice, in a remarkable chapter of her life, had found her way back to Athens before the war and was determined to stay. When Greece was invaded and brutally occupied by the Nazis in 1941, she refused to leave. Living in a modest apartment in the city center, she dedicated herself to working for the Red Cross, organizing soup kitchens and shelters for orphaned children. But her greatest act of courage was done in secret. In 1943, she learned that the Cohen family, a Jewish widow, and her children, who had once been friends of the royal family, were being hunted by the Gestapo. Without a moment's hesitation, Alice took them in, hiding them in the top floor of her home for over a year, just a few yards from the Gestapo headquarters. She used her deafness as a tool, pretending not to understand the questions of suspicious officials. It was an act of incredible bravery and moral clarity, for which she would one day be honored as righteous among the nations by the State of Israel. While her German sons-in-law served the Nazi regime, she was actively subverting it, saving lives at the risk of her own. And where was Prince Andrew? He was a ghost, trapped in the strange twilight world of the French Riviera. When France fell in 1940, the area became part of the collaborationist Vichy regime, heavily occupied and controlled by Italian and German forces. He spent most of the war in Cannes before moving to the relative safety of neutral but German-dominated Monaco. He was a prince of a German-occupied nation, Denmark, and the brother of the king of another German-occupied nation, Greece, which afforded him a degree of protection, but he was effectively a prisoner in a gilded cage, a man without a passport, without an income, and without a country. His isolation was absolute. The war made communication with his family impossible. He could not write to his wife in Athens or his son in the Royal Navy. He followed Philip's wartime career with proud anxiety, piecing together information from old newspapers or snippets of radio broadcasts. He knew his son was a hero, but he could not tell him so. He knew his wife was in Athens, but he did not know of her dangerous, heroic work. He was a father and a husband, but the war had rendered these roles meaningless. He was simply a lonely, aging man in a hotel room, watching from the sidelines as the world he knew was consumed by fire. The war years were a period of quiet, inexorable decline for Prince Andrew. His health, which had been fragile for some time, began to fail completely. A lifetime of stress, heavy smoking, and the deep, abiding bitterness of his exile had taken their toll. He was suffering from severe arteriosclerosis and a failing heart. The once athletic soldier was now a frail man, his tall frame stooped, his days circumscribed by his declining strength. He spent his final years living in a small apartment at the glamorous Hotel Metropole in Monte Carlo. The principality was an island of surreal neutrality in the midst of the war, a place of spies, refugees, and wealthy socialites determined to ignore the cataclysm unfolding around them. For Andrew, it was simply a place to wait. His companion, André de Labigne, remained with him, providing what comfort she could, but his isolation was profound. His world had shrunk to the four walls of his hotel room, a short, slow walk along the harbor, and his memories. He was 62 years old, but he looked much older. The fire of his youth, the burning sense of injustice that had driven him to write his memoirs, had long since faded, replaced by a weary resignation. He was a man out of time, a relic of a monarchical world that no longer existed, a world that had been built on family ties, now rendered meaningless by the brutal ideologies of the 20th century. On December 3, 1944, just a few months after the Allied liberation of France, Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark died quietly in his hotel room. The official cause of death was heart failure. There was no grand ceremony, no lying in state. He died as he had lived for the past 15 years, estranged from his family, a prince without a throne, a man alone. The news of his death traveled slowly across a war-torn continent. It took weeks for the official telegram to reach his son, Philip, who was then serving aboard a new destroyer in the Pacific Theater, preparing for the final assault on Japan. He received the news of his father's death in a brief impersonal message, half a world away. He was, of course, unable to travel back for the funeral. In Athens, which had recently been liberated, a grieving Princess Alice held a memorial service for the husband she had not seen in years. Prince Andrew was buried with little fanfare in the Russian Orthodox cemetery in Nice, attended by a small handful of distant relatives who were in the area. It was a quiet, lonely end for a man who had been born into so much. When the war finally ended, a 24-year-old Prince Philip, now a decorated naval lieutenant, was at last able to travel to Monte Carlo to sort out his father's affairs. What he found was a testament to the totality of his father's fall, the inheritance left to him by the man who had been a prince of Greece. And Denmark was pitifully small. There was no property, no stocks, no fortune. There was only a single suitcase. Inside, Philip found his father's few remaining possessions: some well-worn clothes, a gold signet ring, which Philip would wear for the rest of his life, a tortoiseshell and ivory shaving brush, and a few old books. That was all that was left of a prince's life. In 1946, the Greek government, in a gesture of reconciliation, offered to bring the prince's remains home. A Greek cruiser, the same navy he had once served, sailed to the south of France. His coffin was carried aboard and transported back to Greece. He was finally laid to rest in the royal cemetery at Tatoi Palace, the peaceful country estate where he had spent the happiest days of his childhood. It was a final quiet homecoming for a man who had been denied a home for more than half his life. So how do we measure the life of this tragic, forgotten prince? Was he simply a footnote in royal history, a sad story of failure and loss? The answer is far more complex and far more significant than that. For in a final stunning irony, the personal catastrophe of Prince Andrew became the single most important catalyst in the creation of the modern British royal family. His disgrace and exile were the direct cause of his son's British upbringing. Had the Greco-Turkish War never happened, had Andrew remained a respected senior general in Greece, Philip would have been raised in Athens. He would have attended the Hellenic Military Academy, served in the Greek army, and likely married a European princess, his life following the predictable path laid out for him. He would have been a Greek prince, his destiny tied to the perpetually unstable throne of the Hellenes. But Andrew's downfall threw Philip into the arms of his ambitious Mountbatten relatives. It was his statelessness, his lack of a home, and his education at Gordonstone and the Dartmouth Royal Naval College that transformed him into an Englishman. It was this British identity forged in the crucible of his family's collapse that made him an acceptable, if still controversial, suitor for the young heir to the British throne, Princess Elizabeth. His father's tragedy had, by a complete accident of history, placed him in the exact right orbit at the exact right time. The downfall of the father was the necessary precondition for the ascent of the son. The modern House of Windsor, and the line of succession that flows through King Charles III and Prince William, owes its existence to a disastrous battle on a dusty riverbank in Anatolia in 1921. Furthermore, Prince Andrew's life is a poignant symbol of the end of an era. He was a man of the 19th century, born into a world of dynastic certainties, who was destroyed by the brutal nationalistic forces of the 20th. His family's painful story during the Second World War, with a son fighting for Britain, a wife resisting the Nazis in Athens, and daughters married to German officers is a heartbreaking microcosm of the fratricidal conflict that tore Europe apart and rendered the old family business of monarchy obsolete forever. In the end, the story of Prince Andrew is one of almost unbearable sadness, a relentless narrative of loss. He was a man defined not by the great privilege he was born into, but by everything that was stripped away from him. His military honor, his home, his country, his wealth, his family, and his purpose. He was not a saint. In the lonely wilderness of exile, he was a flawed and broken man who failed to hold his family together. But he was not a traitor either. He was a brave and competent soldier who was made the political scapegoat for a national delusion, a man caught in the unforgiving gears of history. He was, above all, a human being who suffered a trauma so profound that it shattered him and from which he never recovered. His life is a powerful and deeply moving reminder of the fragility of status and the cruel randomness of fate. A royal title is no defense against the deep wounds of personal tragedy, and a privileged birth provides no immunity from a life of sorrow and loneliness. When we look back at the long and dutiful life of his son, Prince Philip, we can now see the shadow of the forgotten father. We can see a man who, having lost everything as a boy, dedicated his entire adult life to the service of an institution that gave him the stability, the home, and the purpose that had been so brutally denied to his own father. The tragedy of the father, in the end, is the key to truly understanding the remarkable life of the son.